Part 1. The seat he paid for the dignity. They took Move the old veteran. He's not on the VIP list. The words cut through the cabin like a blade. The flight attendant didn't whisper it. She said it plainly, standing over him, arms crossed, as if Franklin Nash 79 was nothing more than a mistake that needed fixing. The passengers around them turned their heads, but not one said a word. A child stopped mid-sip of orange juice. A businessman stiffened behind his newspaper, and Franklin, hands folded on his lap, matted Marine caucus cap. Between his knees, slowly looked up at her, the skin around his eyes taut from years of sun and silence. Let me ask you this. What would you do if someone said that to your father, your grandfather? A man who bled for the country, they now say, doesn't have a seat for him. Comment unacceptable if you feel this was wrong. Stay with us. This moment only gets worse. Salt Lake City International Airport, Gate B12. The plane United 1477 bound for Washington, D.C. The time 6:28 a.m. The air outside was sharp with autumn, but inside the cabin tension had already begun to simmer. Franklin had boarded early as instructed, following protocol to the letter like he always had. He wasn't one to demand attention. He never did. He walked with a slight limp left knee, stiff from shrapnel sustained in a firefight outside Quezon in 1968. The scar beneath his trousers still burned when the weather turned cold. That's why he booked seat 14C aisle extra leg room 3 months ago, paying from his social security check because VA benefits were still tangled in paperwork. He didn't ask for much, just space to stretch the leg that never healed right, just space to breathe. But then came the late boarding. A state senator from Utah and his staff. Apparently their block seating had fallen through. The only 3 seats together were 14A, B, and C, Franklin's seat. And as politics often does, it expected silence from anyone who stood in its way. Carol Hensley, head flight attendant, walked over like it was routine. Clipboard tight smile, practiced authority. Mr. Nash, we need you to move to seat 32B. This row is being reassigned to a VIP. Franklin blinked. I booked this one for medical my knee. Carol didn't flinch. I understand, but this isn't up for debate. I'm a disabled vet, he said calmly. She leaned in, voice colder than before. And he's a sitting senator. If you don't comply, we can't close the doors. He paused, not because he was confused, but because he was used to being spoken over, dismissed, boxed in by policy. He looked up at her. So you're saying I'm not on the VIP list? She exhaled. Exactly. It was then a young male crew member rushing to accommodate the senator's team brushed past and bumped Franklin off balance. The old man stumbled sideways, catching himself on the armrest. A grunt escaped him, low and restrained. His hat fell to the floor. No one helped him pick it up. And no one apologized. As he bent down slowly, fingers trembling from age and quiet rage, the senator's assistant stepped into view. She didn't look at him. She just gestured toward the seat. It's done, she asked Carol. Carol nodded. Almost? Franklin Nash stood there, clutching his bag, his cap, his pain, and walked the length of the aisle like a ghost. People parted, not out of respect, but because they didn't want to make eye contact. It's easier to ignore a man when you pretend he isn't real. He reached seat 32B, middle, no leg room, trapped. He sat without a sound. No complaints, no scene. He was used to disappearing. Twist line for thumbnail. He's not a priority, just an old vet. And yet what no one knew, what Carol Hensley never bothered to ask, was that Franklin Nash wasn't just an old vet. He was Staff Sergeant Nash, decorated with the Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded men out of a burning vehicle under sniper fire. The name Nash was etched in after-action reports on the tongues of Marines who still whispered about the man with the bleeding leg who never dropped the radio. And now he sat between a college kid watching TikToks and a marketing director arguing over a Bluetooth headset, all while his knee bent too tightly began to pulse with heat and ache. But here's where the story shifts. Do you believe justice still exists on airplanes? Type justice if you believe one moment can redeem decades of silence, because that moment was 5 minutes away. At the front of the plane, in seat 2A, Major General Martha Callahan, U.S. Army retired, was reading briefing notes for her keynote address at the National Veterans Honor Conference in D.C. She hadn't looked up during boarding. But now she heard the phrase that snapped her attention awake. Just an old vet, he'll deal. The voice wasn't even trying to hide. Martha slowly closed her folder. Her eyes narrowed. She glanced across the aisle at the man now stuffed between strangers. She had seen that walk before, that limp, that silence that screamed. That wasn't just an old man, that was a brother in arms. And she was about to stand up. Stay tuned. What happens next will silence the entire cabin and remind America that honor never expires. Part 2. Forgotten between two strangers, every step hurt, but not as much as being ignored. That's the part people don't understand. The pain of being forgotten doesn't feel like a sharp jab or a loud insult. It feels like silence, like no one seeing you when you're in plain sight, like sitting in seat 32B, knees crammed against a seatback stained with coffee from a flight 3 hours earlier, and realizing that your name meant something once, but now it's just a boarding pass. Franklin Nash didn't complain. He didn't groan. He didn't press the call button. But if you watched him closely, if you looked past the stoic face and the cap he now held tightly between his hands, you'd see it. His leg had begun to tremble, not from fear, from inflammation, from sitting still too long, from being forced into a position his body couldn't tolerate anymore. And still no one noticed. To his right, a college-aged boy in a hoodie was laughing at his phone, headphones in, watching videos. Oblivious. On his left, a business executive in a sharp navy jacket was typing frantically on a laptop elbow, firmly occupying the shared armrest without so much as a glance. Frank sat between them like a relic, like a statue left in the back corner of a museum unlabeled, gathering dust. Now pause. Take a moment. Ask yourself, if this were your father, your grandfather, would you have said something? Type the word notice in the comments if you believe people need to open their eyes, because right now that's the problem. No one was looking, except one person. In seat 2A, Major General Martha Callahan watched. She didn't sip her coffee. She didn't go back to her tablet. She watched Franklin Nash from across the cabin, eyes narrowing, chest tightening. This wasn't the first time she'd seen something like this. But this was the first time it was happening within her reach. And she was no longer in uniform, but she never stopped being a soldier. She pressed the service button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. A junior flight attendant approached. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Martha didn't lower her voice. "Who moved that man from 14C?" The flight attendant blinked, glanced nervously down the aisle. That was per lead crew Carol's decision. The row was reassigned for VIP seating. "I see," Martha said. She didn't smile. She didn't argue. She just picked up her phone, opened her messaging app, and sent one message: "Veteran, in pain, moved against medical need, no one assisting. I'm stepping in." Then she stood. But before she could move, something happened that no one on that plane expected. A sudden groan erupted from row 32. Frank was trying to shift in his seat, subtly repositioning his left leg to relieve the swelling. But the tight space, the lack of aisle access, the awkward position, it all hit him at once. His face tightened, his breath caught. He didn't cry out, but his hand gripped the front seat hard enough for the veins to rise in his wrist. And that's when the businessman beside him snapped. "Sir, could you please stop moving? You're shaking the raw." Frank didn't respond. The man sighed and raised his hand. Carol, the head flight attendant, returned clipboard in hand, all composure and procedure. "Is there a problem?" The businessman didn't look up from his laptop. "The gentleman is fidgeting quite a bit. It's distracting. Can we move him?" Carol didn't blink. "We can't move anyone now. Doors are closed." But her eyes flicked to Frank like he was a task, not a person. A task that needed to stop being inconvenient. "I'm fine," Frank said quietly. But he wasn't. Not even close. And Martha Callahan saw it all. She stepped into the aisle slowly, deliberately, heads turned, the energy in the cabin shifted. There's something about a two-star general in a pressed civilian suit with a military bearing you don't forget. Even without the uniform, it was in the posture, in the gait, in the authority that clung to every step. She didn't walk toward Franklin, not yet. She walked to Carol. "You moved a decorated combat veteran out of a seat he paid for one he medically needed for a senator." Carol stiffened. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you." "No," Martha said sharply, voice steady as granite. "You're going to have to listen." Passengers were watching now, phones lowering, eyes rising. "His name is Staff Sergeant Franklin Nash. He fought in Quezon. He dragged 3 wounded Marines out of fire. That limp, that's not age. That's a medal without ribbon." Carol hesitated. "I wasn't aware. That's because you didn't ask." And then something even more unexpected happened. From row 28, a man stood, tall-built, maybe late 30s, clean-shaven head, wearing a worn Marine's hoodie. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I served under him. Afghanistan. Camp Leatherneck. 2006. Frank looked up slowly. Recognition flickered across his face. "Corporal Moore?" he asked, voice cracked and thin. The younger man nodded, eyes shining. "You carried me out after the IED. You bled more than I did." And then he said 5 words that stopped the whole cabin cold. "I never thanked you, sir." The businessman beside Frank shrank back. The college kid removed his headphones. People were sitting straighter now. A few teared up. Even Carol had nothing to say. And Franklin. He didn't speak. But his lips trembled. The silence that followed was louder than the engines. "Now tell me, what do you think should happen next? Should the general order the captain to reverse the seating? Should the whole plane stand up? Type respect in the comments if you believe this man deserves better. And if you don't want to miss what the general does next, subscribe now. Because what happens in part 3 will make every American stand a little taller." Martha Callahan turns her eyes toward the cockpit. Then she speaks 3 words. "Tell the captain." Part 3. When a general salutes the forgotten, we don't take off while injustice is seated. The words hadn't even reached the cockpit yet, but the impact had already shaken the entire plane. Cabin 3 of United Flight 1477 was no longer a place of routine air travel. It had become a courtroom of silent judgment, with one man in the middle aisle holding the invisible weight of a nation's forgotten dignity. Franklin Nash, once silent, now surrounded by eyes that could no longer look away. And at the front, standing firm like the last wall of moral authority, was Major General Martha Callahan. Calm, precise, radiating something the passengers hadn't felt since boarding began command. She turned to the junior flight attendant beside her. "Tell the captain," she said again, more slowly. "There has been a mistake that must be corrected before takeoff." The young man didn't argue. He simply nodded and moved. Carol Hensley, still holding her clipboard like a shield, finally found her voice. "Ma'am, you're not in command of this aircraft." "I'm not," Martha replied, locking eyes with her. but I am responsible for what I witness in silence. And that silence just ended. Before Carol could retort, the cockpit door opened. The co-pilot stepped into view. First confusion etched across his brow. Then behind him emerged Captain David Harris, mid-50s, trim, silver at the temples, former Air Force, the kind of man who measured his words like they were weights. "General Callahan," he said with professional respect, "we received your message." She nodded once, then gestured slightly behind her. That man was removed from his paid aisle seat, seat 14C, despite a service-connected disability. He was not consulted. He was dismissed. Captain Harris looked past her to Franklin, whose hands still rested quietly on his knees. He scanned the cabin. The businessman who'd complained earlier now shrank back into his seat, avoiding eye contact. The college kid stared ahead, as if hoping the whole scene might disappear. "Is that true?" the captain asked. Carol stepped forward quickly. "Captain, I was following reallocation orders to accommodate Senator Bowers and his security staff. The veteran Mr. Nash did not file a disability note with the airline. We followed procedure." Martha's jaw flexed, but she said nothing. Franklin finally raised his head. "I didn't file a note," he said quietly. "Didn't think I had to beg for what I already earned." That line cut deeper than anything. Passengers began murmuring. One woman in the middle of the cabin wiped a tear from her eye. Captain Harris looked at Carol. "Who authorized this change?" "I did, sir." "Under full discretion," she said, straightening. The captain took a breath, slow and deliberate. "And you didn't ask for assistance documentation, or offer alternative, or even thank him?" Carol didn't reply. "Understood," the captain said. He turned to Martha. "General Callahan, would you be willing to escort Mr. Nash to first class? Seat 1A is currently open." She didn't hesitate. "Yes." And that's when it happened. The captain raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We will be delayed briefly while we correct a personnel error. It will be worth the wait." Franklin didn't move. Not yet. He looked around slowly, at the people who had looked away, the ones who hadn't cared, the ones who now stared at him with guilt or reverence. And then his eyes settled on Corporal Jesse Moore, who stood again, his eyes shining. "You carried me out, Moore," said voice cracking. "Let me carry your bag." Frank nodded once. Together they stepped into the aisle. The silence was total. Carol didn't move. But then the most unexpected thing occurred. A young mother in row 19, Maneen, stood up holding her baby. "I'm sorry," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't say anything earlier. I should have." And then someone else. A flight attendant from the rear galley walked up. "Sir, I served 2 tours in Iraq. I recognize your name. It's an honor." As Franklin moved forward, it was no longer just about a seat. It was about every veteran who had been pushed aside. Every time someone said, "Sorry, no benefits today." Every cold shoulder at the VA. Every social worker who glanced at a chart and never saw a name. By the time they reached the front, Franklin's limp had deepened, but his spine was straighter than ever. Martha turned to Carol as they passed. "You didn't know who he was. Now you do." Carol looked pale, frozen. Frank reached seat 1A. The man who had occupied it, now standing nearby, spoke softly. "I'd never forgive myself if I stayed sitting there." "It's yours, sir." Frank shook his head. "You don't have to give up, I do," the man said. "Because this isn't just a seat anymore." Frank sat down. Not like a man claiming luxury, but like a soldier returning home. The cabin exhaled. Captain Harris addressed the cabin one more time. "Before we depart, I'd like to say something." A pause. Today a veteran was displaced not by accident but by procedure. That procedure failed him. But this flight will not. He looked toward Franklin. Staff Sergeant Nash, on behalf of this airline, this crew, and every citizen who still remembers what freedom costs, we are sorry. And we thank you. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Type respect in the comments if you believe he deserved better. Subscribe for part 4, where one man's quiet courage changes the entire flight. And if this moment moved you, share it, because silence is only noble when the world has already learned. The camera lingers on Franklin, seated in 1A fingers, gently running across the embroidered Marine Corps patch sewn onto his cap. Then slowly the screen fades to black. A soft whisper lingers in the air. Not all heroes wear medals. Some just wait quietly until someone remembers. Part 4. A cabin that stood still. When one soldier stands up, others remember how. Franklin Nash hadn't said a single word since sitting down in seat 1A. He didn't need to. His presence alone had changed the temperature of the cabin. What had once been cold air, filled with judgment, haste, and quiet dismissal, was now still weighted with realization, remorse, and something far rarer, respect. People weren't looking at their phones anymore. No one was rustling through overhead bins or fidgeting with tray tables. The entire aircraft had turned into something it was never meant to be, a place of reckoning. He rested his hands gently over his Marine Corps cap elbows close to his body, like he was afraid to take up too much space. But what made it impossible to look away wasn't the way he sat. It was the way everyone else now sat, straighter, quieter, the way every row had been transformed by what they'd seen and couldn't unsee. Behind him, Major General Martha Callahan had returned to her seat in 2A. She didn't open her laptop. She didn't touch her coffee. She simply folded her hands and stared forward with the composure of someone who had just done the most important thing she'd done in 20 years, and somehow it wasn't even in uniform. But the real shift began 2 minutes later. A soft voice from midway down the cabin broke the silence. "I was there too," a man said. He stood slowly from seat 16F, mid-40s, weathered, grey streaking his beard. His shirt sleeve slid back just enough to reveal a faded Army Ranger's tattoo. Kandahar, 2008. Not under his command, but I saw him. I saw him crawl through an alley of burning trucks to pull 2 MPs out of a flipped convoy. No backup, just him and a field knife. Gasps passed quietly down the aisle like wind through dry grass. The man placed his hand over his heart. I was going to say nothing, but not anymore. He sat. A moment later, someone else rose. A woman this time, young, maybe mid-30s. Flight attendant uniform. Her voice cracked. "My brother didn't make it back from Iraq, but the letter we got, it was from a Staff Sergeant Nash. He was the one who held his hand. The only thing he wrote was, 'Your brother wasn't over.'" Now people were crying, real tears, not just watery eyes, not out of pity, but from the sudden overwhelming realization that they had shared a plane with someone their country should have honored years ago, and had instead asked to move seats like baggage in the wrong zone. In seat 1A, Franklin turned his face slightly to the window, not to look outside, but to breathe without breaking. And then came the moment no one could have scripted. From the very back near the lavatories, a teenager wearing a faded high school ROTC jacket stood up and walked quietly to the front of the cabin. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask permission. He just walked up the aisle, reached into his backpack, and pulled out a neatly folded American flag. Not full-sized, not ceremonial, but real. Cotton. Pressed. He knelt beside Franklin. "I don't have medals," he said, trembling. "But I carry this with me every day. It's from my uncle. He said, "Never give it to someone unless you know they already earned it." Franklin stared at the boy. His lips parted. "What's your name, Ethan?" the boy whispered. Frank took the flag. He didn't unfold it, he just held it against his chest and closed his eyes. If you believe this is the America we need more of, type honor in the comments right now. And don't just scroll past. If this moment moved you, subscribe so you never miss another story that restores dignity where the world forgets it. And if you thought this flight had already revealed all its surprises, you were wrong. The door to the cockpit opened again. Captain David Harris stepped out, a phone in his hand. He walked toward Franklin with the care of a man approaching sacred ground. "Staff Sergeant Nash," he said gently. "There's someone who asked to speak with you." He handed Franklin the phone, now on speaker. "Sergeant Nash," came the voice on the line, gravelly and low. Franklin's eyes twitched. "Yes." "This is General Robert McIntyre. You don't know me, but I've known of you since 1971. I was a lieutenant back then. Your name came up in a commendation that got buried during the withdrawal. I'm calling to say we're unburying it." Frank's grip on the phone tightened. "We're opening a review of your record, not because you asked, but because silence doesn't erase valor." The line went quiet. "Then you have no idea how many men came home because of you." Frank's voice barely made it out. "I just did my job." "Yes," McIntyre said, "but you did it when no one else would, and we never forgot. We just took too long to say it." The phone was handed back. Franklin sat still. It wasn't the words that got to him. It was the timing. All these years, all the folded letters, the visits to VA centers that never returned calls, the ceremony he never asked for and now suddenly had in full. Outside, the sun began to rise beyond the wing, casting gold light through the windows. The co-pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for takeoff." But no one moved, not yet. They were still looking at Franklin, because now no one saw an old man. They saw a standard, a reminder that dignity doesn't die quietly, and when it returns, it commands a room without saying a single word. Stay with us for part 5, the final chapter where honor is not just restored, but remembered. Type "never forgotten" if you believe stories like this should live forever. The cabin lights dimmed. The jet engines whirred. But the air inside that plane didn't just carry passengers. It carried memory. And above all, it carried truth. Part 5. When Honor Returns in Silence. You reminded us who we're supposed to be. The moment the wheels touched down at Reagan National Airport, the passengers of United Flight 1477 remained unusually quiet. Not because of turbulence, not because of protocol, but because something sacred had unfolded in the sky and they were still carrying it. Franklin Nash sat motionless in seat 1A, hands gently resting over a folded flag gifted by a teenage cadet. The same hands that had once dragged 3 bleeding Marines through jungle mud now trembled not from pain, but from the weight of something far heavier: acknowledgement. His eyes didn't wander to the tarmac or the monuments rising in the distance. Instead, they stayed fixed on the sunlight streaming through the window. It illuminated the fine wrinkles across his weathered face like battle scars cast in gold. For the first time in decades, he looked like a man returning from war and being welcomed home. Major General Martha Callahan stood before the door opened. She didn't make speeches. She didn't salute again. She simply turned to him and said, "We'll make sure this isn't forgotten." Carol Hensley, now pale and silent, stood off to the side. The clipboard she once wielded with such authority now hung useless at her side. In the hours since she ordered a decorated veteran to be removed from his paid-for seat, the world around her had changed. The captain had filed an official misconduct report. A supervisor from the airline's corporate office was already waiting at the gate. And the senator she tried to appease. He had already requested to be disassociated from the situation. Carol wasn't escorted off the plane. But when she walked past Franklin to deboard, her voice cracked. "I didn't know." Frank nodded once. No anger, just truth. "You didn't ask." That's what broke her. She covered her mouth, tears forming behind her tired eyes, and stepped out. The passengers didn't rush the aisle. They didn't fight for overhead bins. They waited, row by row, until Franklin stood. Corporal Jesse Moore, the man he saved in Afghanistan, held the small duffel bag. "I can carry it, son," Frank said. "I know you can," Jesse replied, "but let me do it anyway." They stepped off the plane together, and then came the sound, clapping, first from the gate, then spreading like a ripple, not loud, not performative, just steady. A line of airport staff stood at attention, TSA agents, ground crew, 2 Marines from the Honor Guard, and at the end a young woman in a crisp white Navy uniform holding a sign made from poster board and a Sharpie. "Welcome, Grandpa Frank." She dropped the sign and ran. He didn't brace. He just opened his arms. "My knees," she said through tears. "I've had worse," he smiled. And then, as if time itself paused to acknowledge something that could no longer be denied, the airport fell silent once more. A reporter stepped forward, camera lowered. "Sir, do you want to say anything to America?" Frank looked at the camera, then said only this: "We don't need applause. We need memory. If this moment moved you, type 'Remember' in the comments. And if you believe veterans deserve more than just seats on a plane, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this aren't just stories. They're reminders of who we once were and who we still need to be." 1 week later, a letter arrived at Frank's home in Rock Springs, Wyoming. Inside, a formal apology from the airline, a permanent guest of honor designation, and a full refund. But also something else. A handwritten note from General Callahan. "I've led men and women in war, but I've never witnessed such discipline in peace. The world judged your silence as weakness. I knew better." He placed it beside a faded photo of his old unit. And then came one final envelope, this one from the Department of Defense. A review board had reopened a long-lost action report from Vietnam. It confirmed the recovery of 5 Marines under hostile fire by one Staff Sergeant Franklin Nash. His Bronze Star was being upgraded to the Silver Star. Post-approval pending, and signed at the bottom in blue ink, "For valor long denied, for silence endured with dignity." He didn't tell anyone about it. But that night, as the sun disappeared behind the ridges of Wyoming's high desert, Franklin Nash sat on his porch, flag in his lap, and whispered something only the stars could hear. "I'm home. This story isn't just about one flight. It's not about one man. It's about every older veteran who's ever been dismissed with a polite nod instead of real recognition. About the people we walk past in airports, diners, bus stops, never realizing we're passing living monuments." So let us ask you this: who have you forgotten to thank? Because dignity delayed is dignity denied. And sometimes all it takes is one seat returned in silence to remind us that memory, when honored, becomes something eternal. Share this story. Comment "Never again" if you believe no veteran should ever be treated like this again. And most importantly, ask before you assume, thank before you forget. Because someday the man in seat 32B might have been the reason your seat is still there at all.